So we come now to the third of our talks on the Cappadocian Fathers. So far we've had an introduction to them, then we've looked at their involvement with the doctrine of the Trinity and the dispute over the Trinity in the 4th century. And I want over the next 3 talks to look at each of the lives of these 3 Cappadocian Fathers, beginning with the oldest of the 3 in age, Basil of Caesarea, and then moving to Gregory of Nazianzus, who was close to him in age, and then Basil's younger brother, another Gregory, Gregory of Nyssa. So here we're looking at the first, and that is Basil of Caesarea. Basil lived from 329 AD to 379 AD, and therefore he lived for just 50 years, which was a reasonable length of life in those days, but is not a long time, and he achieved a great deal in those 50 years. His family, as I said earlier, came from Pontus, which is near the Black Sea coast in the northern part of Turkey in Cappadocia. His family was wealthy. They were a landowning family. They had an estate of land at a place called Annecy, and he was to spend some time there in his early years as a young man. His family had been Christians for generations. We heard already that Macrina, his grandmother, was a strong Christian and influenced by Gregory the Wonder Worker, who was a pupil of the early church father Origen, who came himself from Alexandria and then moved to Palestine and to Caesarea. Now Basil, amongst many other things, wrote many letters, and I have here a book, one book of, in fact, 4 volumes of his letters, which you can obtain today. They're published by Harvard University, and then the Loeb Classical Series. And he writes here about his grandmother in his letter number 204, which is in, I think, the 3rd volume. I think there were 5 volumes in all. And he says this: "And what indeed could be a clearer proof of our faith than that we were brought up by our grandmother?" How important grandmothers are. "A blessed woman who came from amongst you. I mean the illustrious Macrina, by whom we were taught the sayings of the most blessed Gregory," that's the wonder worker, "as many as she herself retained, preserved to her time in unbroken memory, and who moulded and formed us while still young in the doctrines of piety." So there we have Basil reflecting many years later about the influence of his own grandmother Macrina, who was herself taught by Gregory the Wonder Worker. Basil's education was very thorough. He was taught by his father, who was a professor of rhetoric, which was a classical subject in which he looked at all the authors of the classical period and taught about them. He was a member of a large family, had 4 brothers and 5 sisters, so there were 10 children. 2 brothers became bishops. Gregory, who we'll hear more of later, of Nyssa, a place in Turkey, and a brother called Peter of Sebast, which is almost, I think, in present or in Armenia in those days. And a sister, another Macrina, like her grandmother, who was a great influence upon her brothers, and in particular Gregory of Nyssa and Basil. He had a classical education. He went to Antioch to learn his grammar there. He was taught by a philosopher called Libanius. And aged 21, he left Turkey, as we call it now, or Cappadocia, and went to Athens, to the University of Athens, one of the premier universities of the world in those days, where he met the fellow Cappadocian father, Gregory Nazianzus. More about him later. He studied carefully, he did the classics, he looked at science, he was impressed by the Aristotelian method of observing things around you, classifying them, and he was interested, as I say, in what we might call science today. Later, he was skeptical about the use of classics in education, and he wrote extensively on that. Then he returned home, and when he returned home, he resolved to follow what he called the philosophic life, i.e. he wanted to have an ascetic existence. He wanted to live in a community, a monastic community of his own making, up in the region of Pontus, close to the Black Sea, and on his family estate of Anissa. Not only that, but he travelled with a friend with whom he later disagreed called Eustathius, and they went on a kind of monastic tour of the area of Palestine, of Syria, and quite possibly to northern Egypt as well, looking at monastic life, reading the great fathers whom they could get hold of. And he wrote a book then, one of his first books, called the Philokalia, in which he transcribed large amounts of Origen's teaching into this book, which we still have, even though Origen's writings, many of them were lost because he was anathematized by the church later in the 5th century. There was a strong monastic streak in Basil's life. He then attended a synod at Constantinople in 359. He got involved in the dispute over Nicaea and the definition of the Trinity. He put forward his own position powerfully, and he took the homoousios position of saying the Son is of the same substance as the Father. In other words, he was noticed as a clever, energetic, powerful leader by the authorities in the church of the time. And in 364 AD, he was ordained a priest in the church. By 370, just 6 years later, he had become the Bishop of Caesarea, which was the principal town and capital of the province of Cappadocia. He now became a leader of the church, a leader of the Nicene party. And I would say his leadership as a bishop is marked out by 3 things in particular, which we'll look at more when we come to study some of the texts that he wrote. The first thing, which I've already said, is that he was involved in this controversy over the Trinity. He was pro-Nicene. He gave full support to the Nicene Creed. He believed that the word homoousios was the right word to describe the relationship of the Son to the Father. He also advocated the full divinity of the Holy Spirit and wrote later on a book about the Spirit as well. And he brought together a party of people within his diocese to support this teaching, even as sometimes he trampled on people's toes in doing so. Secondly, he was known for the social justice that he stood for. He began a hospice in Caesarea called the Basiliados, in which he cared for the sick and the dying, the traveller and the poor. And he greeted, we're told, those who are sick like brothers. He was a man of great compassion and of action as well. And thirdly, and the last thing, about which more later, he was drawn to the monastic life. He was always a monk himself. He was a bishop, but he was a monk. He never married. He liked the philosophic life of being apart and there seeking God himself in places of quietness and rest. So he was a very important figure in the early church for those 20 to 30 years as a priest and then as a bishop. And having looked at him now, we'll move on to his colleague, Gregory of Nazianzus, in our next talk. Thank you. Shukran.